Hello, welcome to Land. And today I'm talking to Jim Davis, who is a activist, political agitator, and I'd say religious studies scholar of the lay bent, meaning. Have you studied religious studies formally? I know you've written 2 books on the subject.
A little bit. I took a couple of master's level classes about a couple of decades ago.
Okay. Jim and I actually go back a long time. I've known you online, I think, for a decade, and we also have mutual IRL friends. So,
right.
My colleague Jean Bajelon told me, about the side of what you do on religious studies, specifically focusing on Ismaili Shia Islam, and I've also noticed you wrote a book on Pure Land Buddhism.
Yep.
Those actually overlap with my own interests, because despite the fact that Egypt is a predominantly Sunni country, the Aga Khan is highly respected in Egypt, and there is a kind of duality about the attitude towards Ismaili Shia in Egypt. And that got me interested in Ismaili Shia in general, because all I really knew about them is they weren't the same Shia as the people who ran Iran.
Right.
And something about the assassins, 1,000 years ago.
Right.
So I realized that I had a very limited understanding of Ismailism. So for our listeners who may not be up on Islamic studies, what is Ismaili Shia Islam?
All right. It's a branch, of course, of Shia Islam that developed. It's kind of split off of the main Shia around the 7th Imam, Jafar. What he basically usually it's inherited by the elder son, the imamship, and his oldest son was Ismail, and he basically died before his father did, and that kind of like upset the succession. And then when he died, most of his followers picked the next oldest son to follow, but others believe that Ismail only faked his death, sort of. He just went into concealment, and so they followed him, or followed the dyes that proclaimed his imamship, and so it became an underground movement. While the regular Shia stayed above ground and were basically persecuted by the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad. The other group went underground, mostly around Syria, Damascus, and that type of area. It became an underground movement that spread basically person to person. And it gave rise to splinter groups like the Seveners. It gave in the Cromartians, I'm probably mispronouncing it, who ended up setting up their own independent country around Bakaran, which became like in Islam became like their utopia, and it lasted about 200 years. But it was a slave utopia. Citizens had everything, basically shared everything in common, but it was produced by slaves and maintained by slaves. But the other groups that were around the main group sort of started migrating into North Africa, where they converted a few Berber tribes to it, and they raised revolts in Algeria, Tunisia, and were successful, eventually creating a big army, invading Egypt, and becoming the beginning of the Fatimid Empire, which at one point actually conquered Baghdad and looked like it was on, just for a brief second, it was going to become the dominant, and then it collapsed.
Yeah. Its collapse actually led to another religion, the Druze, but that's
Yes.
a completely different story. No, Fatimid Egypt is interesting, and I mentioned it on my interview of Puya Ali Magam on Sunni Shia relations and how that's overstated, but that the Salafi Islamic influence of Saudi Arabia has sent to purify Sunniism in Egypt, because there are a lot of practices such as the Sabiza. For those you don't know, it's like self-mortifying prayers where you do the pray so hard that you create a permanent welt here, and stuff like that are seen by the Salafis as crypto Shia, crypto Ismailism in specific. But the Aga Khan is still popular there. I mean, very popular there, largely because of the extent of charity that the Ismailis do now, which is something that I don't hear talked about enough. Would you like to go into that a little bit?
Yes. Basically, ever since from the third Aga Khan, after World War II, they decided to go very big into like third world development, even in countries that did not even have their, like Egypt has hardly any real Ismailis living there except for people who work for the Aga Khan. But they've gone out of their way. They as a group of people, they've been very successful in business, very successful, wealthy in a lot of their endeavors. And by their self-taxing, they have a religious tax of about 12.5%. Plus, they have other in-kind taxes that they have in their Jama Khanas. They accumulate a lot of money. And basically, they spend a lot of it on development in various countries. And they're also very big in the former Soviet Union, in the Pamali area of Tajikistan.
Tajikistan, yeah. So yeah, Central Asia in Islam is something we could talk a little bit about, because there's a complicated politics in post-Soviet Russia about Sunni and Shia Islam, where Shia Islam is seen as more copacetic to the kind of cultural remains of the Russian Empire, and Sunni Islam is seen as a threat to it. And this shows up geopolitically. Now, one can be cynical and flip that and say, well, the geopolitics is actually what's really driving this, not this old cultural attachment based on the prior to the Soviet Russian Empire. But there does seem to be something there. You see this in the Russian relationship with Iran. You see it in the prevalence and protection of Shia minorities and Sunni majority Central Asian states, which is better than Shia protections in, say, the Gulf, where they, basically don't exist. But even in the Gulf, a lot of the tensions between Sunni and Shia are geopolitical and economically inflamed. They're not actually modern, long-term sectarian wars, because the sectarian wars are relatively recent after the end of persecution. So basically you have the classical sectarian wars, right? Which people know about, like the legends of the assassins and all that. Mm-hmm. And then you don't have anything for 700 years. I mean, There are small outbursts of violence, but nothing like you saw in the later half of the 20th century. I think Westerners don't understand how these groups coexisted. Would you like to talk a little bit about Sunni and Ismaili relations?
Recently, I mean, the whole thing historically, the Ismailis basically, since the fall of Alamut, have been mostly living in either areas that are under Iranian influence, which had been at one time Sunni and then went to Shia, and they're kind of more relaxed in religious views. And in India, where you have the Mughals, were controlling of, this huge Hindu population that was difficult to try to convert, and they basically gave up. So they had a form of tolerance where they tolerated, and so other groups, including Islamic heretical groups considered heretical, like the Ismailis, were given enough free space as long as they didn't, push it too far, so to speak. When that would happen, then you would have outbreaks of local violence, and then it would dissipate for a while. But mostly, they survived by, since the Mongols, when they destroyed Alamut in 1256, is they became a Sufi order. Mm-hmm. Everybody thought they were basically Sufis, and that's how they were tolerated in Iran. Even though it was an open secret that they were, quote, heretics, as long as they, didn't try to, seize power, they were very well tolerated. And that leads to the first Aga Khan, who basically in like 1840, he decided to revolt against the Iranian Shah, and lost badly, and had to flee toward India, where he became a ally of the British in one of their wars, I think in the Sindh area, and against the Afghans. And as a reward, he was allowed to settle in Bombay, and where he connected with his followers that were already there for like hundreds of years. And then he rebuilt his base up, but he was still basically an Iranian outsider and like that. And then basically he's also basically seen as a British client by other Muslims, and that started because the Ismailis came out in the open because of the British not persecuting native religions in India. They gave them a free space to flourish. And of course, it caused division also amongst the Ismailis on who's an Ismaili, and or who collects the taxes, because locals were collecting the taxes on behalf of the Imam, and basically keeping it for themselves. Now the Imam appears on their things and wants it directly to come to him, and so you have an economic conflict going on, which led to a few schisms in Ismailism.
So, what in modern Ismailism, what has been the general stance towards the state, since there has not seemed to be a renewed call to establish an imamate state under the Ismaili?
Yeah, basically they're basically keep to the law of the lands that they settle in, be good citizens of those countries, be philanthropists in those countries, and basically try to create as much goodwill for the group as possible.
All right.
Their biggest from the outside.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we could talk about the relationship to Sufism, we could talk about the relationship to leftism, but I am getting a question about theology. What are the theological differences between Ismaili and Provo Shia? I don't think there's actually many. It's mostly about how the succession of the imamate goes, right? Right,
because the Ismailis believe they have a living imam who is like the 49th descendant from Imam Ali, who was like the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and so they have that connection. Why the other Shias kind of stop at other imams, and of course the group in Iran in control is the 12, like the 12ers, the 12th one, and so that's the biggest thing. One of the biggest open things is that the Ismailis are open to change, because their imam is able to change the doctrine according to the times and according basically to his will, which the other Shia are not. They're kind of like tied to past presidents, mm-hmm. And while they're really open to reinterpretation, it's not as easy as having someone who could just say it.
Right. So, for those who are a little bit more knowledgeable about Islam, this means that there's a kind of different attitude towards Hadith scholarship. Since the Ismailis have a living imam, they have someone to interpret Hadith very quickly, whereas everybody else has to do it based off doing comparisons of lines of succession and applying it to this and that legal jurisprudence. Very much actually like in Jewish halakhic law. And I think that is something, for example, when people try to understand the differences in groups of Muslims, they always go to the Quran, which won't help you most of the time to even understand most Islamic practice. Like, it's not really the pillars are in there, but beyond that, it's not in there. Like, the disagreements between like both the five, there's at least 5 accepted forms of Sharia, plus a few, and that doesn't even, I don't know about the Ismailis in relationship to Sharia, but plus there's the whether or not one has a strict or broad definition of hadith. And actually a lot of the more, quote, fundamentalist or Salafist Muslims have a broader definition of hadith, not a more limited one. But the Ismailis don't seem to have that problem in the same way. Like, you don't have that. The Aga Khan does seem to be able to kind of mitigate a lot of these interpretative differences, which seem to be, I think people misunderstand how fractious like the Sunni world can be in particular, because there is nobody to interpret the differences in hadith, and this leads to more extreme groups saying other groups are unfaithful or not observant.
Yeah, for the Ismailis, their Iman is sort of like referred to as like the living Quran, because up until recently, most of the people in that group, especially from South Asia, from the Pakistan and northern India area, never used the Quran because it wasn't written in their language, and basically it was an oral. The religion was an oral tradition, brought to India by dais, which they call them peers, which is from the Sufi terminology, and so it was all oral, and it had like this tradition of ginans, which are songs. There's like over 1,000 of them, and which carried Ismaili doctrine, and basically to the people who listened to it like that. And they were very successful in converting several trading castes to that religion. But that's why they're very big on the interpretation from the Iman. But at the same time, especially today, there's like a freedom of multiple interpretations that people are, as long as the Iman hasn't set a definite definition of something, you're free to interpret things as you want to. So there's a plurality of meaning. And also recently there's been a return to, reading and interpreting the Quran, which did not exist like 100 years ago in that community. And so it's almost like, and also because of their outreach to the Muslim world, there's almost like a veneer of a Sunnification going on in that community. But people in it see it more as the practice of concealing one's real beliefs when there's an opportunity for being persecuted. So
taqiyya is what it's called, right?
Yeah, taqiyya. And so you have groups, groups that do that. And in fact, there was in northern India a group around the city of Parana in which they would have mosque. On the first level, it would be like a Sunni mosque, but they would have an attic, which would be the Jamakhana, where they would actually perform, but they would perform Sunni rituals below.
So this leads us to talk about a little bit about like the relationship to Sufism. And I think Sufism is a little bit misunderstood. Well, not a little bit misunderstood, a lot misunderstood in the West. I think a lot of people think of Sufism as twirling hippies who happen to be Muslim, and then like Coleman Bark translations of Rumi poetry, which are not particularly reliable. What do you make? When I was reading the history of Hadith interpretation by it was a Western scholar who is Muslim, but I forgot his name. Jonathan A.C. Brown, I think. I'll look it up. And he was talking about uh, Ismaili hadith, and he had mentioned that after Alamat, there was a deliberate adoption of terminologies from Sufism. In what other ways did the Ismailis adopt Sufi practices, and what are Sufi practices?
I think the whole idea of song was a big one. It was a big one. The Sufis did have a lot of songs. Why the Sunni usually in most of their sharas that the ritual practice are anti-music, anti-song, but not always. There's a slippery room around it, but just depend on how fundamentalist people are. But people being people, they like songs, and it slips back in, no matter how a fundamentalist wants to drive it out. And so that was a major thing, adapting the religion to songs, to ritual actions of meditation came in at that time. There doesn't seem to be very little evidence of meditation in Ismailism until after Alamut. And of course, it could be something that they just didn't write that stuff down. But after that seemed to be part of it, especially when it got to India. A lot of meditative practices and like that, and a de-emphasis on religious law. That's the big thing. Under the Fatimids, the Ismailis were very rigid. I mean, they had their own school of Sharia. But by the time of Alamut, because they had the idea of Tiamat, which was the end of the law, basically in 1164, when the Imanite came out of hiding under Hassan II, basically they declared the end of the Islamic religion, basically, and that they could have direct connection with the divine. Which didn't last very long. They kind of retreated from that right before the Mongol invasion, but it still exists, and there's a lot of writings that talk about that event. And it seemed like after that, the Ismailis were not that interested in enforcing rules anymore. Outside of vague, you have dua 3 times a day. But it's not. There's nothing. There's nothing. You're not going to be punished if you don't do it. They don't do the fasting now. It's not like a month of fasting. They only do fasting on when the new moon is high on Fridays, which is like 2 or 3 times a year. And that's the only.
So the observance of Ramadan is significantly different from almost every other form of Islam.
Yeah. So their fasting's that way. They do not do the pilgrimage anymore. The pilgrimage is to seek the presence of the Iman. And so that's a turn from there. And of course, their ritual prayers are different from their duas are different from the Sunni and other Shia. I think the other difference. They don't do Zadak because they actually do a tax, a desan, which is a direct tax, 10% for the Iman and 2.5% for his peer. But the last 2 Imans were peers also. So basically 12.5% of one's income went to the Iman.
Mm-hmm. So this leads me to ask, if the practices are that significantly different, we do need to talk about the 2 other religions that are linked to Ismailism, which are Druze, which honestly, I don't know anyone who really knows that much about Druze because you're not supposed to. And to some degree, I've been trying to discern what the relationship to the Alawites are, because the Alawites may be a Shia sect or they may not be Muslims, and they seem to emerge around the end of the Fatimids. But
yeah, well, basically, like the Walis, if I'm pronouncing it right, in Syria, basically came from when the 11th Imam of Shia died or was poisoned and like that. They believe that he didn't die, and so they branch off at that point. But it became very, very synergistic with Christianity. They probably picked up some Druze stuff. they have like a trinity, Muhammad, Ali, and Salman, which was like a Zoroastrian convert. Is there a trinity? They use wine in their services. And so you have that going on. I don't know how much influence maybe from the Kurdish pagan religion of Yazidis came into that. But also, they gave rise to another very similar to another religion, which is a very form of Sufism that's in Turkey and in the Balkans area. I can't pronounce the name of it really well. Baliki. Okay, those, and there's basically Sunnis that are extremely liberal and everything. They really don't follow the rules very well. And they basically follow peers or masters, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Hasidic Judaism too, where you have your Rebbe, and you follow him until he dies, and then you attach yourself to another one.
I actually wanted to talk about that a little bit. I have a mixed background, Jewish and Eastern Catholic, and I was amazed at how similar, even not just Sephardic Jewish, which is my heritage, but even Ashkenazi Jewish culture was to Islamic culture. That the attitudes about law and law interpretation are similar. The attitudes about even stuff like rabbis and highly mystical things. So you have highly mystical teachers involved. There's parallels in the Hasidim and the Sufi. Like there are direct parallels, including up to singing and dancing, which is normally not totally frowned upon in Jewish services, but there were groups of Haradim who did. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, we think about Hasidim as ultra-Orthodox now because they are, but in late medieval Europe, the Hasidim were actually a spiritualist reform movement against various forms of Haradim, which are the more strict legalist school. And this happened mostly in Eastern Europe, but the parallels of stuff that happened in the lower Balkans and in Central Asia are almost direct, and they happen at about the same time. And so this kind of gives me a way to pivot a little bit, but we will go back to Ismailism. You're also a leftist. You're not just a religious scholar. And so political economy falls into your purview. What do you think the relationship is between these religious developments and political economy? And why are there so many concurrent developments between religions, do you think? Just speculating off the top of your head.
Religions and economics. Basically, coming back to the definition of religion is something that ties people together and ties people together with a commonality, so that people could, what your neighbor is, what he believes, and like that. So what to expect, and so you have that basis. I'm not really big on like the Marxist idea that that religion's a reflection of the economy and like that, because I think religion is pre-economic. The idea on animism back in the hunting gathering days and like that, they arose together, so to speak. So, and I'm not the one. I don't really believe that religion's ever going to go away, like some people believe, and that Marx hinted at. I think it's going to be here as long as we're here. There'll be some form of religions. There'll be some.
Yeah, I tend to think that the word religion is a little bit confusing to people because it almost is predicated on there being secularity, and before you have the development of modernity in particular, and honestly not just capitalism, but capitalism in the specific European sense, there is no need for a difference between secular and religious because they're pretty much a coextensive like communal universe, right? Like it's people believe a certain thing within a certain community. There, and I will also say that Talal Assad, I believe is his name. I'm trying to remember the exact modern Muslim scholar, but who points out that secularity also comes from a kind of Christian bifurcation of political and religious power, which frankly just doesn't exist in most religions worldwide. Even ones that are not particularly theocratic, right? Like, so for example, it's hard to explain to people most of the early Islamic deviations because in the West, because they are political, essentially. And they're about interpretations of law, but law here extends towards a broader definition than the state law. And I find it interesting that Ismailism seems to have developed a very an individualistic is often used as a bad term here, but I don't mean it this way here, but a very individualistic interpretive framework for how they view law outside of pronouncements by the Aga Khan, who is also not really a state figure anymore. Someone says, it seems like Islamic conquest was much economic integration as conquest by the sword. I would actually say almost definitely so, because in almost all those Islamic expansions, religious minorities who shared a vague framework were pretty much left alone. And in fact, we're not like up into like in Egypt, up into the 18th century, like they didn't even want all the Christians to convert. They'd lose a tax base.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Also in like North Africa, Islam mainly expanded through trade, from the Sahara part of Africa down and toward the central part of Africa. Islam came through traders, came through traveling Sufis. I can't even really think of anything that was actually up until the modern period, until, like the Sudan and the Mahdi there, where there was actually any force involved.
Yeah, the force seems to have been mostly aimed at conflicts between Christians and Muslims in expansion into who's going to control Southern Europe. And that's, that has its own complications. But even then, I think about, there's a lot made of this now, but like how the Sufi orders, even in like India, could even bridge, like they even tried to actively bridge Hindu-Muslim divides. And Hinduism before modernity is also hard to call a singular religion too, which is that's a whole nother can of worms. I'm of the unpopular opinion that you can't refer to Buddhism as one religion either. So
no, that's
I don't know what Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. I mean, I know they're directly related, but Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, like share like 3 or 4 postulates, and that's it. They don't even have the same metaphysical view of the universe. So, you also wrote a book on Pure Land Buddhism. What is your interest in that, particularly in the West?
Well, actually, because I still consider myself a Pure Land Buddhist. I became a Buddhist back, I think, around 87, 88. And at the time, I was kind of looking for a religion that was less objectable than any others. And I settled on Buddhism. And it took me a while to actually settle into Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism was kind of caught my interest in the fact that it is more secular, even through the idea of having a savior type Buddha is kind of contradictory. But when you realize that Amitabha Buddha is actually yourself, it's your future self, your future enlightenment, where everything's futurely going to be enlightened and like that. You just accept it. You just accept that. There's nothing you have to do, because it's all in the long run. Eon after eon, everything's going to be right. That's the whole crux, the whole center.
So I can talk a little bit about my background here. My ethnic background is Jewish and Christian, but my father was a convert to Insight Buddhism, which tied him into the Theravada community, and I was brought up around a lot of Cambodian and Sinhalese Theravadins. Sinhalese, for people who don't know, is a majority ethnic group of Sri Lanka or the Tamils. And what I found interesting about that is there's two views of Theravada Buddhism, and one I saw in the kind of insight communities is basically like secular in the sense that there are no metaphysical beliefs whatsoever. All this is just psychological. There might be rebirth, there might not be. And then my experience of Theravada Buddhists who were not like Thai forest school, and even in America, but from Asia, was not that at all. Lots of talk of multiple hells, lots of talk of not deities exactly. The calling gods is not incorrectly metaphysically correct, but you are talking about non-human beings of somewhat infinite power. There's magical practices, big stuff to do with statues and amulets. And I don't see that to discredit Buddhism. And one of the things that's interesting about Pure Land Buddhism, particularly as practiced in the West and like the 3 or 4 major traditions in America, is it's mantra based more than insight and mindfulness meditation based, right?
Right. Yeah. Basically, the tradition that I came associated with, the Jodo Shinshu, it's basically the Nabutsu. My cat knocked over something. Basically, Nabutsu, which is like the chanting of the mantra, which I use is like Nama Amida Buddha, and like that. But also the other important practice is that you give up all the other practices. The whole thing in how it came about during the 13th century in Japan is you had all these practices that were brought in from China, so 300 years earlier, where basically you had to be a monk, you had to do all these huge meditations, whether if it was tantric or whatever. It just took a long time. It took more than one lifetime, basically, and it excluded a lot of people in Japanese society, especially since the majority of the Japanese at that time, or not, I shouldn't say the majority, but a huge chunk, were an outcast group in Buddhism, because they developed anybody that was involved in raising animals to kill, slaughtering, fishermen, things like that, were outcast. And so they were considered, they did not have Buddha nature. They were they had no hope, basically. And so during the 13th century, various groups came about. The introduction of Soto Zen, the introduction of some new tantra ideas.
Shingon, right? Shingon develops in that time. Yeah.
And then Nichiren, and then both.
So Nichiren is very similar to Jodo Shinshu, but it's not the same.
Right, they chant the name of the Lotus Sutra instead, and they hate the Pure Landers for it, even though it's very similar. Then Shinran, basically, you had Honen was the first of the Pure Land people. He had got into conflict with the authorities a lot. And then Shinran was his disciple, but he just basically turned a lot of Honen stuff upside down, basically. The whole idea is it's very, you abandon all the rules. Rules are not going to help you at all. And in fact, by trying to follow rules, it shows that you do not accept the Buddha's gift, basically. So it's very antinomial in that respect, and which gave rise, and it's kind of interesting in Buddhist cultures and like that Pure Land or very Pure Land related have always been associated with rebellions in Buddhism, especially in Japan. You have the Iko rebellions during the 16th century, where basically the Pure Land sects took over cities in Japan and ran them democratically, basically, for 100 years or more before the shogunate started, during the 16th century, put them down and unified the country. So you had that, and then also in Korea, there were a lot of peasant uprisings done where peasants under the name of Amida Buddha in Korea would burn down both Buddhist temples and the state buildings,
Yeah, I was actually, because the Korean example is interesting because Jodo Shinshu didn't develop there, but there was Amitabha practices related to both Tendai and Son Buddhism, both branches that would develop the same tendencies. Um, I think we need to explain a little bit though, because you and I are both insiders to both these worlds, so this needs a little bit of unpacking. Who is, or maybe in this other than yourself, what is Amitabha Buddha, and also talk about why there's 3 Buddhas important to Pure Land and not one. So would you like to talk a little bit about that? Like Amitabha is the big one, but there's at least 3 important ones in most forms of Pure Land that I know of. So
Well, I mean, in Pure Land Buddhism and in Jodo Shinshu, the Buddha has 3 bodies: one historical, one mythological, and one ultimate, basically. Yeah. And each one of them are a manifestation of each other. And you could even go further, like in Nichiren or in Tendai, where all these things intertwine with the Tendai.
Yeah, or even in Tibetan Buddhism, there's the same 3 Buddha body idea. Yeah.
And so Amida basically is basically a mythological body of the historical Buddha, that the historical Buddha told this tale of a Buddha that came before, who basically, because of how bad samsara was, he decided himself that he would not become a Buddha until he did all these practices that saved everybody, basically. And because he became a Buddha, that was considered proof that he did all these things. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the Buddha. He'd still be a bodhisattva. And so that's the background mythology to it. And basically, in Pure Land, you basically accept that through faith. Basically, that they don't say that they're enlightened, because it seems it's so uppity for people in that tradition. But it's something like your future enlightenment is already assured, and the future enlightenment of everything's been assured. And the whole idea is to accept it. There's nothing you can do to stop it or to unstop it, basically. Mm-hmm.
So this actually gets me to a thing that differentiates Pure Land from other forms of Mahayana Buddhism, and this is common to Japanese Buddhist sects, not just Pure Land. Is the idea that there was a need for a new Dharma because the Dharma had reached its complete degenerative cycle, but there was no Maitreya Buddha on the immediate horizon. Mm-hmm. And I bring this out because this is one of those weird parallels in human thought that does get me thinking a lot about the patterns of human thought, because this shows up in a bunch of religions that are structured in like this. It shows up in Christianity, but Christianity is only one cycle, right? It's a linear view of time, but it has a similar like degenerate age, revitalization, faith and revitalization going on. Also, it has in its Protestant form has stages of history that are clear and delineated. Whereas in like Japanese Buddhism, there's clear and delineated stages of history, but they're cyclic. So, like Pure Land Buddhism is going to emerge because the Dharma has reached this point. There are no more arhats. No one can even do that anymore. It's too hard for whatever reason. We're too far away from a Buddha, and the next one's not on the horizon. So we put our faith in this prior Buddha to metaphysically go into a Pure Land. And we do it by what people who are not Buddhists would consider magical means, which is, mantras are prayers, but very specific ones, like, and over again, which is a super common practice in the Buddhist world. This is one thing I think even in Theravada Buddhism is Western Buddhist converts generally don't get. There's just repetitive chanting of stuff all the time. Like, you just chant sutras and you chant this and you chant that and you chat in a language you don't really know. And that's another thing about Japanese Buddhism, though. They chant in like an altered...
Yeah, Sino Japanese.
Yeah, and an altered form of Sino Japanese that has a clear relationship. So you say Amida, I keep on saying Amitabha, which is the Indian because of the traditions I'm raised around. I'm going to use those words. But the Theravadan tradition deliberately, and this is maybe similar to Islam, chants everything in Pali because it's the language of its scriptures. It probably isn't the language Buddha actually spoke, although there is some argument for it. Because Pali is more closely related to a South Indian dialect, and everything we have, if Buddha existed, he existed in the borderland between India and Nepal. But there are some scholars, Richard Gombrich, who argue that Pali is actually probably closer to the language that Buddha spoke, and that the South Indian is a later inclusion. I don't know. I'm not a Sanskritist. I can't comment on any of that. But I think this is interesting to talk about. One thing I think we have to deal with, though, is there's a lot of responses to this that take this responses in terms of modern society. Like, for example, Buddhism is seen as hyper-individualistic, which I find as weird, but I definitely agree in terms of how it's used in Western converts. It's interesting, for example, that Pure Land Buddhism has kind of a reputation of being the peasants' Buddhism, and thus uppity in Asia. And in America, it's kind of seen as like, well, I think because of Soka Gaya, which is actually not Pure Land, it's Nichiren, but it's
Nichiren.
Nichiren, which it's related, right? Like, but it's not. But
they both came out of Tendai.
Yeah. And Tendai it comes out of Sino quasi-tantric Mahayana. So, and for those of you who are totally lost, so is there a Buddhist equivalent to social liberation theology? Yes. Actually. There is definitely now in particular.
Engaged Buddhism.
Yeah, engaged Buddhism, and that comes out of two movements. A lot of it does come out of the Pure Land Japanese schools, and then there's a separate ray that joined up with it out of the laicization of Theravada in northern India in the beginning of the 20th century, and that's where insight meditation comes from, and mindfulness meditation comes from. So if you go to one of those places that do Vipassana only, or you talk about mindfulness, that does kind of come out of this. But originally, one of the reasons why that form of Buddhism was super popular is some forms of Theravada Buddhism had reaccepted the caste system, and this came out of a reform movement, which particularly was aimed at low caste individuals in India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and also in creating religious practices that were not solely for monks. And so that's actually where like the Western Insight Buddhism guides come from. But that also has to be read, and it was interpreted through the lens of colonial administrations. So there's a weird relationship between Western convert Buddhism and British colonialism and the way it was brought to America. So yeah, this is my these two. Obviously, I was glad to have Jim on because I wanted to talk about this for a while, because I am actually often appalled at leftist religious illiteracy, not just about like exotic religions like what we're talking about, but even like Christianity and ones around here, like what is, and to be fair, a lot of modern Christians don't know either, but like, what is the difference between a Baptist and a Presbyterian? I know, but do you? Like, and why does it matter? Well, it matters because a lot of people's social relationships are totally mediated by these things, even in a secular world. One thing I like to talk about is like when I travel the world, secularity looks different based on the religion that it broke away from. Like, it really does. If you spend a lot of time in Japan versus a lot of time in Europe, yes, capitalist modernity is very similar, but there are like things on the edges that are very, very different that even affect work life, like the way work is organized, that have religious and cultural religious roots. So yeah. Have you read? There's a lot of people talking about the Ron Purser book, Mac Mindfulness. Have you read that book?
Which book again?
Mac Mindfulness: How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality.
Oh no, I know about the book, but I have not read it.
Yeah, I was Ron Purser's friend on Facebook, so I could probably look it up. I think the book is interesting, but I think it is kind of talking about a modern phenomenon that is to take insight and mindfulness practices, totally psychologize them, and remove them from their context, right, and then sell them to you as a religious treatment. They do have some efficacy. I mean, as a psychological treatment. They do have some efficacy that's been proven psychologically, but I think it's overstated. And I also think it has been used to as basically like capitalist stress management. Someone said Catholic secularism has way more aggressive quality to it, for lack of a better. Yes, it does.
Something similar to what they've done with Insight, by what I call elite Buddhism. Something similar to what's going on right now with the ancient philosophy of Stoicism being resurrected and taken apart and resold as a psychological tool.
Yeah, do you want to get me ranting? Because one of my hobbies is classics, which is a hobby for me, which is weird. I just outed myself as the most nerdy person on earth. But I get mad at the way Stoicism is treated as a purely psychological phenomenon, because they have a very specific metaphysics and theology and I don't even like calling Hellenistic philosophies, because if Buddhism and Hinduism are religions, then Hellenistic philosophies were religions. Like they had Stoicism has a theology about everything being a physical manifestation of God. God is a physical being. Zeus is a physical being. And they're basically creationist determinist. And that's why they have the attitude they do. They also had interesting thoughts on physics and Platonic, like numbers, which I saw as a manifestation of Zeus. And when this is presented, even by people, like I like Massimo Pagliucci, for example, but even he is really bad about not mentioning all that background for why they were teaching what they were teaching, and they teach it instead as like ancient cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah. Or even Zeno's political views in his Republic.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Zeno, basically, he originally was a cynic. But then he developed his own school. Cynicism basically is a practice, not so much as a school of thought, so to speak.
It's like radical Stoicism historically. Like it's even more. It's like it's a more radically practiced form of Stoicism.
Right, and it's very hard and difficult. If you actually wanted to do it, it takes a society that probably wouldn't kill you for not participating in that society. It takes a certain level. That's why cynicism didn't really get into Roman society very well. Why on the outer edges of the society it did. And actually, I read a book that actually claimed that Jesus was a cynic and makes a good case for it. But that's
there does seem to be some overlap between cynic teachings and Christianity. Once you get out of the whole cynic parrhesia shock practice, which is like masturbating in public to make a point and stuff like that.
Yeah, but back to Zeno. Zeno basically, he was considered the founder of Stoicism, and one of his things he critiqued Plato's Republic by creating his own republic that doesn't survive. But what parts of it that does survive are the differences between him and Plato, because people made comments on that, and one of them was, he took basically Plato's idea of communism to a different level, that the entire world is the city, that we're all citizen. The whole idea of cosmopolitans came from Zeno, that you're a citizen of the universe, a citizen of the entire world. And basically in his idea of the future city, which encompassed the world was no temples, no police, no military. Basically, no laws outside of your own self virtue.
I mean, and what's interesting is that reminds me of there's two ancient schools that it kind of overlaps with. You have Cyrenaicism, which is like hyper-hedonism. But hyper-hedonism, they consider themselves ultra-Platonist, and that you didn't respond to any authority, and all, like any subjection to authority should be for your own self-interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't last very long. They're associated with the city of Cyrene, and they last basically 3 generations. But their primary founder, whose name has slipped my mind, is associated with Plato. It's actually one of the people mentioned in the dialogues, and that's similar. And then Epicureanism, in its radical Greek form, is another philosophy that kind of caught on in Rome, but not extremely, because it has the same sort of you have a moral obligation to live outside of society so that you can have equal relationships, because that is impossible in society. So you can choose to live in a garden, and to simplify your wants and tastes. So it's a pleasure-derived materialist philosophy. That's what Marx was doing a Hegelian reading of when he was doing his dissertation. But it's also one that's world negating and basically says you can't participate in society and have equality, so that your only real option is to opt out to these gardens and kind of maintain your
counterculture.
Countercultural way of life. And it gets somewhat recuperated into Roman society through Lucretius, right? But and the physicalist theories of it, but the whole ethical phenomenon is kind of left out. And it's also like it's completely misunderstood because the way we use the word, because like while pleasure is the primary principle for Epicureans, the how you get pleasure is to simplify your want for pleasure. Like you get pleasure by just like, I really enjoy drinking water and eating garden food. Like that's how you do it. And I'm not worried about gods, because even if they're real, they're material. And we all die eventually. Which is another thing that's interesting about these ancient philosophies, which are often presented as atheistic, right? But they're not. Like ancient Buddhism, ancient Epicureanism, they were they were not. They just treated gods as physical forces, and you didn't care about them. Like they actually were. Most of them seem to say that they existed, or it didn't matter if they did or didn't.
What's interesting in Buddhism, especially the early Buddhism, that you had, when they did mention Hindu deities, they actually listed Brahma as a lot. The creator god was very involved, and I think he was very involved in the Buddha's enlightenment myth. And so it's kind of intriguing, because in regular Hinduism, modern Hinduism, Brahma, the creator god, is basically a god that nobody worships. I think there's like only one temple in all of India devoted to that deity. And a lot of it has to do with the incest taboo, because in order for Brahma to create everything, he had basically had to have sex with his children and daughters and like that in order to create everything. But it was that Buddha, that deity that appears frequently in old Buddhist literature as protectors of the Dharma. And I just find that interesting, and it could be maybe that is why Brahma became a figure not liked in regular Hinduism, but they were kind of like stuck with him anyway.
Well, it's also interesting how Buddha was reincorporated into Vishnuism through the avatars of Vishnu too. But that's something that Buddhists utterly reject, right? That's kind of a later Hindu gloss on why, like, you don't have to destroy these Buddhist sites. And when I say, go ahead.
There is also an Ismaili here. One of the Ghanans talks about the 10 forms of Vishnu. They associate Vishnu with Ali, the former lives of Ali. So you have this long epic poem about the prior lives of Ali, and one of them is the Buddha. And they actually have this one thing about the life of the Buddha. And of course, their version of the Buddha is completely different from ours, because in Hinduism, and especially in Vishnuism, the Buddha was sent to trick the demons, that not the demons, the asuras, the bad anti-gods, into worshiping the wrong way.
Who are good gods in Zoroastrianism, are good angels in Zoroastrianism, was totally confusing. But
yes, upside down.
Devas and our word for devil are probably actually related etymologically in Proto-Indo-European. So it's interesting. Yeah, the whole upside down thing. That's a debated contestant. There's a scholar, another scholar whose name slipped. I'm getting old. Scholars' names are leaving my mind. Who I'll look it up. Who talks about early Indo-European culture and makes that link. David Gordon White. He's also the author of Cynical Yogis and a history of the Yoga Sutras and this and the other. So I think this is fascinating, because the whole thing, the time with Ismailis and Sufism I was going to bring up actually earlier, is political pressures caused forms of syncretism to emerge in India that didn't develop anywhere else, and also didn't survive modernity because the sectarian pressures through the needs for national, the way ethnicity and religion are tied together constitutively, and the way that became tied to national projects meant that a lot of these synchronistic movements were not viable in the modern world. And I don't think people really understand that there's a direct tie to nationalism, and a lot of these older, weirder, more liberal, like late medieval, middle medieval, even early medieval forms of religion just fading away because they don't fit into these ethnic categories that we are forcing upon the world. And some communities adapt to that. I think Ismailism is a good one. I think, for all my complaining and talking about and implying that Western convert Buddhism of the mindfulness school is a little bit silly, I think that's actually what's going on there too. That it's a survival mechanism for a society that is kind of hostile to practices and couldn't support, it's hard to support a monastery in the modern world. Particularly because monastic relations, and why there was often peasant revolts against them, as people forget this, they were semi-feudal. Yeah. They needed bound labor. Now, that was another thing that was interesting to the Japanese reforms. Since we're talking about all this together, and I do want to tie the political economy of it together a little bit. Japanese Buddhisms, almost all of them, made their monks do work, and their secular priests do work. So they either in the forms of sin that have a secular priesthood and not just monks, and then in the Pure Land and I don't know about Nichiren. So what is? Does Nichiren have monks anymore? I don't think so, right?
No. It just depends on what sect. The one that the Sakai Gakkai was associated with before their big split in the 90s was a monastic caste, but they married. They weren't like monks in the West. They married, had families, and like that.
So they're not like traditional monks. They could marry and have families, but they were monks.
Right.
Okay,
it was more like our priest. But they just kept all the traditional terminology, but they subverted the office.
Yeah, so that I think that's interesting, but it's I think that's one of the things that caused it to change, is that Japan had to modernize from a semi-feudal system, and as these religions wanted to survive, they had to give up, depending on peasant labor, either through or they had to do so solely through donations, which is what they did in the Theravadan world, and some state patronage. But in the East Asian context, Buddhist modernism, which is not just a Western thing, by the way, people should know this, forced a whole lot of reforms of the institutions. But it's interesting because this was kind of an inner Buddhist fight. And again, to make parallels to other religions, you see similar things in the Franciscans actually enforcing poverty, partly because they didn't want their people dependent on feudal holdings, and they wanted to appeal to the poor instead of, I don't know, subject them to labor to make them maintain the monastery and the chapel and the king, which is really hard to do, particularly when they're starving. So, there are some contemporary leftists who have an ideological myth about this leading to the creation of capitalism, which I find interesting, but I don't think is true. But I think one of the things that, well, I probably do hold slightly more traditional Marxist views than you on the relationship between religion and political economy. I do think the impulses that lead to religion are pre modes of production. Are pre divisions of labor divisions. So we have evidence of religious practices before we have evidence of clergy. So, in that sense, I do agree with you. And it's, in the sense that, I think clergies usually do relationship, like some of these religions are particularly dependent on certain kinds of relations of how surplus is distributed. There are ways that the world changes, but the values and virtues they engender don't go away even after that happens. And if anyone's traveled a lot to cultures that are very different, you do see it, even when they're all capitalists. And the way these ideas mix and merge are interesting. And people talk about how that happens in Eastern religions all the time, because yes, and you could technically be a Shinto practitioner, a Buddhist, and have Confucian or Taoist, depending beliefs with some overlap. But they don't look at it in the terms of the Abrahamic religions. For example, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are totally in dialogue with each other in a way that has changed all three of those religions. I don't think I maybe this is unpopular to say, but I think classical Judaism doesn't look anything like rabbinic Judaism, at all. It would be hard pressed to really call it the same religion, even though maybe it worships the same God. And that's because Judaism's in dialogue with Islam and with Zoroastrianism a lot. The more I learned about Zoroastrian practices, I was like, oh, it's a whole lot of rabbinic rules that read a lot like Zoroastrian practices, guys, including even the name. But so all these religious ideologies intermix and inform each other, and they also change, in my mind, as modes of production change, because certain things are not viable anymore. It's really hard to support a monastery and these mass monastic complexes that existed in medieval China or India or Sri Lanka without some kind of feudal order or some kind of governmental patronage. But monks can survive without that because they can just be given donations. Or in the case of Korea and China before the revolution, and Japan, they can just do work. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. I think that's also true in the West, because one of the reasons why monasticism is probably less popular is it's a bigger ask, but also it's harder to support. If you have massive monasteries, who would support it? Mm-hmm. So I think that's interesting. To kind of, I want to thank you for coming on today, Jim, because I love talking about this. People can see me get excited when I talk about this stuff, because I'm essentially kind of anthropological minded. I think we should really know the world as it exists for people, and the actual history here. And if you're religiously illiterate, there's just whole swaths of human experience you cannot talk about. You just can't. Right. So I guess I want to ask you, how did you get interested in Ismailism if you're a Pure Land Buddhist?
It was kind of strange, actually. basically about the same time that I got into Jodo Shinshu. They used to be at the Buddhist Churches of America in San Francisco. There was their bookstore was run by a Tibetan Buddhist who had her own. She made a newspaper, basically to sell books, a lot of book reviews and stuff like that. But she'd also have articles that people would send to her, and she would do that. And also she would, do some of the BCA, their own theological propaganda would be in there too. So there was a whole mixture. And so all of a sudden I started getting this in the mail. And I'm assuming because I had subscribed to Tricycle or something that I got on their mailing list. And so I got that and bought a few books from them and got interested. But one of the things they did was they had a line of world books of other religions and stuff like that. And so one of them was a book by, I can't think of his name now. The guy that is Hakim Bey, Wilson, Robert Wilson. Anyway, he had a book called Scandal: Essays in Islamic Heresy. It was one of his books, and he delved really deep into Ismailis, especially around the Alamut period, and also he had a few really strange references to Shenran and Jodo Shinshu that kind of nailed it for me. And strangely enough, it was through Wilson that I decided to become a Pure Land Buddhist. But I had this book and I picked it up from time to time, and then I took a class, one of the first at my local university, MSU, where Eugene teaches at. I took one of their first online master's level religious studies classes, and one of the things you had to do is specialize in a religion not connected to your own. And so that the Ismailis kind of hung out, and I thought, well, I'll just do some work in that direction, and that's what I did. I ended up writing a paper. I actually started an email group, a Yahoo email group devoted to it. They got up to like 500 people was involved at one time before, they pulled the plug on their groups. And so I got to meet online a lot of Ismailis and like that, and got to become friends with them and things like that. And I got to learn a lot about stuff from the inside a little bit. Of course, I had several attempts to try to convert me, but anyway, that's how I got interested. And also, I started my own little zine devoted to Ismailism called Kiamat. I had like 5 issues of it before I folded it, and so a lot of the articles that are in my book come from that zine. The same way that my Pure Land book that I wrote came from. I also did a Buddhist zine called Eco. The last I did it for about a year, and a lot of those articles became the book. Cool.
All right. Where can people find your books?
Some of them are still available on Amazon. I'm kind of like in a dispute with my self-publisher, and so I'm going to be switching all of them over to a new print-on-demand publisher. So you can still find them, but they're high-priced on Amazon. Apparently, other people could sell your book at any price they want, which is kind of funny.
That's sad, actually.
Yeah, kind of weird.
I mean, yeah, I guess if they're selling it on the secondhand market, they can. But it is strange.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the world of do-it-yourself publishing.
Yep. The world of micro publishing isn't very different, to be honest with you. Even though, I technically didn't self-publish, it's like, who knows?
Yeah.
So, well, thank you for coming on, Jim, and maybe sometime we'll talk about your activism on another time. But I really think we needed to talk about basic religious literacy, and particularly in these two kind kind of interesting religions that kind of break the stereotypes in both of the cases that we mentioned that people have about these religions. And I to be fair, Israelism is a kind of small religious group, but Judo Shinshu is much larger in America than people realize. It's actually one of the largest forms of Buddhism.
Yes.
People just don't think about it. They always think about Zen and Tibetan.
Right. Because you got to think about elite Buddhism, ethnic Buddhism, and then you have a whole other category with the Nichiren's in the United States, sort of like a working class Buddhism. Because most the Nichiren groups, especially associated with the Soka Gakkai, are basically based in the working class. A lot of Latinos and Black African Americans are involved in that religion.
Yeah, just out of just like observation, in Salt Lake, I've been to Tibetan, to Zen, Judo Shinshu, a Nichiren, and Insight group. The Insight group was the whitest, although it did have Latino people there. But it was the whitest. And then Judo Shinshu, Sokagai, and actually our Tibetan is Ningampa, which is a non-monastic form. So they were all fairly diverse as well. However, it does seem like to have earned your rank in your various empowerments, which, yes, they're empowerments, you do have to be of a certain class because you have to have a certain amount of free time to do the rituals. The Nundro takes a long time. If you don't know what the Nundro is, guys, it's one of the fast tracks to enlightenment, and it's basically saying like hundreds of millions of prayers plus hours of meditation a day. But you're like literally supposed to be chanting mantras on the back of your throat really fast all day, whenever you're doing work, whenever basically you're not speaking to someone. So there's a lot of fun stuff there. I think it's I would just say that even American Buddhism is not fairly represented by the ideas people have about Silicon Valley religious converts. It's just not what probably the majority of a religion is, even in the Tibetan and Zen cases, although it's probably more true in those cases than in others. I'd like to thank Jim for coming on, and I hope you guys learned something tonight, particularly those who are somewhat knowledgeable about religion. I hope you gained some knowledge, and those from you who are religious illiterate, I hope this at least stokes some interest in why you might want to study this. So, thanks, Jim.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
All right. I did a major Patreon announcement last time, so I don't need to do any more tonight. I will be doing a Q&A for patrons only in about a half an hour. Jim, again, like to thank Jim for his time, and we're going to end the broadcast here.